Hi everyone, welcome back from lunch. So our next talk is by Ashlee Wilkins, who got her PhD at Maryland, but now she's working in Congress, and she's going to tell us about science policy.
Okay, all right, thank you. Let me just start that. Oh, I have to actually turn this on. Oh gosh, I may have made it angry. Oh, okay. Now I think that is working. It sounds like I'm mic'd. Cool. Yeah, so thanks to the organizers for organizing this great conference. I have never been to the UT Austin campus, so it's a good opportunity for me. Although, like probably a lot of folks, Austin was my first AAS, so I do have fond memories of the city. And thank you for inviting me and giving me this chance. This is my first talk to the astronomy community since I've started my new job, so I started this in March. And I'll talk about my job currently, and I'll talk a little bit about, and a lot of this is from context that I learned as serving as your AAS Bacall Fellow, which is essentially a postdoctoral fellowship that the AAS sponsors. If you don't know anything about that, I'd love to talk to you about it. It's a really great opportunity. It's what helped me get my current job, and is why I think I still qualified as a postdoc when they were initially formulating invitations, even though I'm not technically a postdoc any longer. And so my current job is that I work for Congress. So I work with and it's a bit of a mouthful, but I am a professional staff member on the Subcommittee for Space and Aeronautics, which is part of the House Science, Space, and Technology Committee in the House of Representatives. And hopefully by the end of this talk, you'll know what all of those things mean if you don't already. I should do an obligatory, that's the wrong button to push, an obligatory note that this is just, I'm here to represent myself and informed by my experiences on the committee, but of course I'm not here to preempt any members' opinions, particularly, or anyone else that I am employed by or could potentially be construed to be representing. I don't, I promise. All right, so I think that probably a lot of, so this talk, my goal here is to give you an idea of what's going on in policy and how some things work, but I also know that people come from very different levels of background when it comes to science and astronomy policy in particular. So I'm going to jump around a little bit. I'm going to mention a lot of things in passing. If I use an acronym or use a term that somebody has not heard of, it's okay. You can interrupt me and ask. I'm trying to make sure that I define things as I go along, but even folks in policy have jargon just like we do in science. But I'm aiming to not take up the full 40 minutes and have an extra long period of time for Q&A, because I'm curious what you all are interested in, because I could talk about a lot of different aspects of policy. So hopefully that's kind of where we're going with this. And feel free to ask questions during the talk also. So the first kind of question here is sort of, what is your relationship as a scientist, as an educator, to the federal policy system? The most obvious kind of first thing that comes to mind is the fact that most astronomy is funded by federal funding, particularly by government funding, and it is you, astronomer, submit proposals, and then ideally, at least some fraction of the time, they return funding back to you so that you can pay yourself and or your working group. And that's sort of the big thing that everybody thinks of. But of course, there are lots of other elements of and do that the whole time. Lots of other elements of you being a scientist that are directly affected by federal policy. I should note also that I'm going to talk almost exclusively about federal policy, but astronomy can be impacted by international policy, especially folks who are here at a state institution. Of course, there are going to be state level and even local level factors there that I won't really touch on, but we can talk about if you're interested in. So you as a scientist, as an astronomer, you've got students and you've got your own education. Much of that is touched by federal policy. Publications, there are laws about the accessibility of taxpayer-funded research once it becomes published and produced, or whatever comes of that research. Similarly with the data, there are lots of federal policies and regulations that impact that. Collaborations, especially when it comes to, or one thing that is often an issue is international collaborations, how you are able to interact with your international colleagues, whether that's travel, whether that's visa regulations. There are lots of ways that in your everyday life as an astronomer, you see direct impact of federal policy and regulation, which is why you should care at least somewhat. one of the punchlines of this is that everyone, I think, should care, has a responsibility to care somewhat about policy and be informed at least at a baseline level. Not everybody has to be fully informed on policy all the time. You do lots of other things, but there is sort of a baseline that I think is really important because it has such an impact on how you're able to actually do your science, on who gets to do science, who has access to science, and what we get to do with the results and what are the implications of what we learn. But the other thing is that it's not just sort of those direct, sort of everyday in our doing of science, is that, astronomers, we live in a world where we don't get to, and certainly not small groups of astronomers, don't get to decide everything for the rest of the world. There are ways that indirectly, I just stole a few screenshots from headlines that have significant impacts where sort of astronomy runs up against the rest of the world in different ways. There are the issues around Mauna Kea, what rights we do or do not have to a sacred mountain. There's the fundamental question of the rights and who has the power over the night sky when this was brought to bear with the Memorial Day weekend launching of the Starlink satellites from SpaceX, and those are not the only constellations that will be going up very soon. Out of curiosity, how many of you were surprised by the Starlink constellations going up? Okay, none of you are radio astronomers then, right? So how many radio astronomers hate constellations and have already been sort of aware of some of that? So this is somewhat, maybe. This is a plug to say that you should listen to some radio astronomers, that this has been an issue for a while, but has become much larger of an issue because we were not aware of quite how much of the problem in the optical is, or could be, or will be. Another aside, and we can talk more about the constellation issue. If you weren't aware, it just was announced last week that SpaceX is planning to do another 30,000 satellites on top of the 12,000 for the initial Starlink. Yeah?
Sorry, quick question.
Yeah, so the question for the recording is are they dim now? So yes, they are much fainter than they were when they were initially launched. And I think that's a lot of what caused a lot of the concern is that they were very bright upon initial launch. But once they reached the orbits that they were actually going to be going into, and it had to do with their angles and various reflectivity and what light was getting reflected, they are much fainter, but they still, so there were only 60 that were launched in May, and even that small number could potentially have an impact. I think some of you may be involved in some of the efforts. There's a lot of community efforts in the astronomy community right now to try to quantify the effect, because we don't have a straight answer of like what magnitude would they need to be, or like if you were to tell a company how would you how do you need to design your satellite so it has a lower albedo or whatever. And we don't, as far as I have seen, those answers are not there. I know that the AAS and a lot of the observatories, the large observatories, are getting together to have those conversations. But there's no regulatory regime for this. So in radio, the reason the radio astronomers know about this is because it's a radio spectrum sharing issue, has been with constellations. It has been honestly for a couple decades, starting with other companies a long time ago. But this is in essentially optical spectrum sharing, sort of, is that we're seeing effects in the visible spectrum, and there's no laws that require satellites to be not visible in the sky. There's nothing that forbids them from anything, and so that's part of a very big open question on what the right approach to this, if at all, may be. Because there are also other arguments for what economic and technological breakthroughs or abilities might be enabled by satellite constellations. Yeah?
Is there any movement towards creating any kind of standard or policy around stuff in that regime?
Nothing concrete, in part because we don't know what the right approach is or what is really needed. I think this caught enough astronomers. It caught astronomers by surprise And so I think it's still a very open question, but it's moving quickly. And so if the astronomy community wants to do anything about it, the community needs to figure out what, say, the astronomy community needs or would like to see happen, and do that fast. And I would say very fast would be the ideal. So if you at all are involved in any ground-based observations, if you haven't started doing the calculations on how this might impact what the measurements that you make, now would be the time, for sure. And of course, earlier this year, so just sort of in the theme of how we don't live in a vacuum, and it's probably good that it's not just that astronomers get to decide everything for everyone, but we also had to deal with the federal shutdown. And this is a picture, if you didn't see, this is Jane Rigby, if you are familiar with her. She's an astrophysicist at Goddard, and several of the Goddard scientists that's in the Hart Senate office building, went to some of the protests as furloughed federal workers during the shutdown. So there are lots of ways that sort of maybe unexpectedly or expectedly, but in ways that are a little bit more indirect or in a sort of bigger picture than just your sort of everyday astronomy life. And so there are lots of reasons, this is sort of my point is that there are lots of reasons to care about policy and to be stay at least moderately informed. These are the kinds of questions I know that I was getting questions from, my family who saw things in the news about about Mauna Kea, about the Starlink satellites, and we're just asking about that from the astronomy community. And we don't have a lot of answers yet. So there's a lot of text here. This whole presentation has a lot more text than the typical science presentation. I'm sorry, we don't have as many cool figures, or they're way more boring when they're in policy. So I wanted to I did this as sort of an exercise of just who is in the federal policy ecosystem for astronomy in particular. There are lots and lots of players, a lot of players that I feel like people are not as aware of. So I wanted to sort of point out some of those. And also just so we're all on the same page. Funders, as I said, is mostly the federal government, and that's NSF, NASA, and the Department of Energy. I think DOE is often underrepresented in some of these conversations, but one thing I learned as the Bacall Fellow, and I didn't even know before then, was that the DOE is the largest funder of federal funder of basic physical sciences research across the entire government. There's a lot of physics research, and some of that goes to astronomy, particularly in the areas of like cosmology, dark matter, dark energy searches, that sort of thing. And then, so you've got Congress, obviously. There are appropriations committees and there are authorizing committees. I'll talk a little bit more about what that means, but essentially the appropriators are the folks who do the annual budget process. And then the authorizing committees are for setting policies, which sometimes those things can get blurred, but essentially that's how it's supposed to work. In the Office of the White House, and of course the federal funders are all, executive agencies are all part of the executive branch of the government. But then you also have the political, both career and political, but the Office of the White House, and so there are several entities there. The Office of Management and Budget, or the OMB, the National Space Council and the National Science and Technology Council are both interagency councils, so a lot of the White House coordination is supposed to be at the sort of coordinating different agency efforts where they're overlapping or other interaction that needs to happen. And a lot of that is managed out of the Office of Science and Technology Policy, which as of January this year, essentially as of the moment that the shutdown ended, has a director, which is great. There are many advisors in the astronomy policy ecosystem. A lot of folks, again, this is something I feel like is not as well advertised. This is a way to be involved. If you wanted to be involved in policy as an active astronomer, is to see who's doing the advising and make sure that if you want to be part of those conversations, to be in those conversations. Every agency at NASA, down to the division levels, and even below the division levels, down to the program levels, have advisory committees. And these are committees of external folks, not people who work at the agencies, but astronomers like everybody in this room who are there to advise on how the programs are running. And there are lots of laws around how those have to be open, how they do calls for new members every year, and it's very open, tries to be a very open and transparent process. It's also the national academies, which I'll talk a bit about in a minute, your professional societies, advocacy organizations. There are a lot of advocacy organizations around science, and higher education. There are also think tanks, research institutes, FFRDCs that are places that do analytics, And then the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, is actually a part of Congress, but they do oversight. They write very informative reports that get really deep into budgets and delays of certain large telescopes and that sort of thing, as well as agency inspectors general also do that. And one last thing I want to point out on the user side, those are probably the folks you know the best, but also that there's a lot of connection between those who play roles as advisors and the user side, and particularly that the role of lobbyists in DC, and that many of the users and operators in astronomy have lobbyists. Every institution has lobbyists. UT has an office in DC and has their own lobbyists, I believe. Some use consulting firms, or some use external firms, but I think that's another thing that folks don't always realize, that you're being represented in DC and advocated for. And again, if you want to have a say, if you want to know what they're saying, you can get involved. That access is there. But most institutions do. The managing organizations like AURA, USRA, AUI, those folks, they all have lobbying arms as well. And so they play a role in Washington. And in general, the input, and there are lots of these advisors, lots of folks who are giving input, but the lucky thing that we have in astronomy is that we have the decadal surveys. And so these are now, so astronomy originated the decadal survey process. No other scientific field had done this. It started in the 1960s. It was essentially just for ground-based astronomy to start with, but then grew very quickly and was very useful. And now we have decadal surveys for the space sciences. We have them in solar and space physics for heliophysics, planetary science, and in astronomy. And then the last thing there is the DOE, I always forget, but it's the P4 process that does, it's physics particles prioritization process, something like that, yeah. P5, there's a fifth P. I forget the fifth P, I'm sorry. But anyway, these are these community-based consensus priority setting. They set recommendations on a long time scale. And if you go back and you look at particularly the astronomy decadal process, because we've now had enough of them, the things that get on the top of the list get built. And especially when you look at the large telescopes on the ground and in space, all of them came from decadal survey recommendations. I cannot emphasize how valuable they are and the level of esteem that they are held in Washington as well as in the community. They are incredibly important. They are on, especially committee staff like me and the folks that I work with, we all have our own copies on our bookshelves. Members reference them all the time in hearings and in other places. These are really important and they're really unique. There are other science fields that have tried to do decadal surveys and to not nearly as much success for various reasons. I think some of it actually is about the sort of inherent nature of the way that we do astronomy, that it works very well, but these are very important processes. And in particular, I wanted to just highlight the National Academies. There's an obligation, if you talk about the National Academies, they require that you show a picture of Abraham Lincoln, because the National Academy of Sciences was started in 1863 in the middle of the Civil War, passed by law, established by Congress as an independent entity to consult, for the government to consult on any sort of scientific matter, subject of science or art. And so the Academies does the decadal surveys, but they also they can either initiate their own reports if the National Academies sees somewhere where they think there's an important issue that scientists need to come to consensus on or comment on, but they also will do a lot of other kinds of reports. In the last year or so, they've done a lot of interesting work. They did the astrobiology science strategy. Somebody mentioned yesterday the exoplanet science strategy report was also just released about a year ago now. A year and a half ago, they released an excellent report looking at sexual harassment in STEM with a lot of concrete actions, policy and community actions. So there are a lot of really great reports that are worth checking out. They are generally very long, but they're written with policymakers in mind, which means they always have a very short to the point section at the beginning, and they tend to actually just repeat the same thing and do that like 3 times, just in more levels of detail, so you don't have to read the whole many hundreds of pages that most of those reports are, but they're really excellent. And another bonus, if you want a reading recommendation, the science, or the NASA History Office actually puts out a lot of, they are books, but they call them something else. They're like reports that they put out. And there's one that was just from a couple of years ago called Science Advice to NASA, Conflict, Consensus, Partnership, and Leadership. And it does an excellent job of overviewing how the academies and NASA in particular have interacted, and how the Space Studies Board came to be, and how NASA gets its science advice over its full history. The other thing is, of course, to just mention is that we are in the full swing of the Astro 2020 project. I'm guessing that a lot of you participated in submitting white papers because it was a record number of white papers. There were 573 science white papers, which I think is a factor of 3 or so more than what were submitted in 2010. It's, I think, at least twice the size of what was submitted to the Earth Science Decadal, which was the last decadal that the academies did just a year and a half ago. 294 papers were submitted to the APC, which was the access programs, and it was the everything not science paper. So it was for the state of the profession, for policies, programs, anything else. And I want to emphasize to the community that there are a lot of things that the community gave feedback on in various ways and had persistent advocacy on for the academies since Astro 2010. And there were real changes. It is not always easy for the national academies to change, and there are definitely still more things that they could be changing, but there have been concrete changes to the way that this decadal is structured, and to what's going into the decadal, the resources that it's getting because of community advocacy. So that's an example of where you really can have an impact. And just if you are not already on the list, they do have a listserv for the decadal. They're doing semi-regular webinars, like they're doing one next Monday, I believe in just a week, next Monday, yes. They are supposed to, I believe, also start doing visits around the country, but a lot of their process from this point forward otherwise will be fairly closed door because the panels have been created, and now it's up to all of these panels to start meeting and deliberating and actually writing some kind of report that should be out in the next year and a quarter or so. So to step back, now that that was sort of a lot of the astronomy context, I would say. So we're going to step back for a minute and talk about the policy and government side of the House. And so just so we're all on the same page, a reminder about, or a refresher from your 8th grade civics course, or especially if you're an international student or otherwise had not seen any of this. US government is structured. The broad structure is that we have 3 branches. We have the legislative branch, that's where Congress is, that's where I work. They write the laws. Executive branch is the president and all of the executive agencies, including NASA, NSF, all of your favorite agencies. And that is where the laws are carried out. And then the judicial branch interprets the laws. I will not really be talking about the judicial branch, and my expertise is with the legislative branch, of course, but we'll talk about also the executive branch a bit. I want to point out, just because as a policy person now, we get to be nerdy about things that are actually written truly in the Constitution. And I think it is very interesting that science appears in the Constitution, that one of the powers of Congress is specifically to promote the progress of science and useful arts. I'm not sure, probably it's up for debate what useful arts really means, but I think it's pretty cool. And also what amounts to patent and copyright, all part of the same clause, but I just thought that was an interesting little tidbit that you can pull out when people ask you about why we should be funding science. And at a very minimum, you can say it's right there in the Constitution. In Congress, there are, the structure of Congress is that it's many, in terms of the staff and the way that the offices are organized, is a million, essentially about 500 little fiefdoms is how it is often described, which is to say that each office gets to run very much, it has a lot of discretion on how they run. So staff of Congress are federal employees, but we are not civil servants in the standard sense. If you know anything about like the NASA, how the civil servants, they have this, the GS scale in terms of standardization of pay and how your experience translates into pay and into promotion opportunities and things, and none of that exists for the staff of Congress. They get paid much less than the GS scale, and it's very much you are at-will employees who are just attached to your member's office. In a member office, there's not much in the way of HR other than sort of benefits management, and that's about it. And so each office can be a little bit different, which is part of what can make this a little hard to, it makes it a little less, in some ways can make it a little less accessible because you don't necessarily know exactly what you're gonna, what to expect if you're going in to visit your member's office. But there are some things that are shared. So, and what I particularly want to point out is the difference between a member office and a committee office. I work for a committee, but most staff will be in member offices. So each member of the House, there are 435 of them, plus 6 delegates, and then each member of the Senate, there are 100 of them, have their own staff, their own office. The Senate staff is generally bigger and generally slightly more well paid. The House is typically, it's about 18 staff members for one member of Congress, and that staff has to be split. That means anything that they need to do that's related to their actual office. So they usually split it roughly a third for in their district for like administrative, constituent support type things, like if you want to do a tour of the White House, or if you call and you're angry about something and they need to answer the phone and tell you that they are taking note of what you said, which they do. They do always write it down. They do pass it along. It really is, it does matter when you call. It can make a difference. That means only about a third of their staff is working on legislative issues, which means in the typical member, in your representative's office, that means they have 5 to 7 people working on every policy to spread across every policy issue that they could possibly have. That means that the legislative staff have very wide portfolios, because usually of those 5 to 7, one of those is the legislative director, so they're in charge of everything. And so really it's only like 5 or 6 people that split the portfolios. So the person who works that you would talk to, if you're going in and say, I want to talk about astronomy funding, or I want to talk about this telescope that I think needs to be built or needs to not be built, anything related to that, that person is one person who has the whole, what they'll call, there's no astronomy portfolio, there's not even a space portfolio, it's the science and technology portfolio, but they also have 3 or 4 other portfolio areas. So they're the person who has to work on everything related to science and technology, but also maybe immigration and justice and abortion and education. And so that's one person. They are typically in the House. They skew younger than in the Senate, and they tend to not stay as long. The average lifetime is something around 3 years, although there's a wide range there. They are typically in mid-20s, not far out of college. They might have a political science degree or maybe a law degree. Rarely do they have scientific backgrounds in terms of their degrees. They are, and I don't mean that to say, they are generally brilliant, so that the folks who get to work in the House, it's very competitive to get there, and they are very good at what they do, and they are very intelligent, and they are very bright, and they are very good at seeing through if you're trying to puff up something, or trying not to be very honest, or trying to add shine where shine is not. They are very good at that, but they are also not necessarily directly experienced in a lot of the kinds of work that we do. And so that's where communication is very important. But it also means that your reputation and your honesty can be very important, because they need help. If an issue related to astronomy or related to space comes across their desk, they need help. They need to know who the experts are in the field, who they can talk to and they can trust. But it's they may come from the district. They may, a lot of staff in district offices, not all, but a lot of them come from the district, may have worked on a campaign. And their job is to work for that member and focus on that district, that location, that constituency, the specifics there. The contrast is the committee staff where I work. So we work on, not for any particular district, we are there to work on a particular portfolio of issues, section of the government. So I work with the science committee, so we do everything, and I'll show you what our jurisdiction is, but we would do everything in science, space, and technology, essentially. committee staff is split between, you have the majority staff and you have the minority staff attached to the party. And generally people do not flip parties. And so if your party loses the House, you go into the minority. And so your staff has to get cut in half because the staff budgets are split 2/3, 1/3. This is also part of why committees, so the reason that split is there is because the committees do a lot of the work of Congress in terms of writing legislation and determining how legislation gets to move forward. And the majority gets to decide most of that, and so they have to do a lot more work, which is why they need the larger budget. This is also why, not just purely based on numbers and wanting to have the majority votes in Congress, but this is another huge reason why parties want to have control of the House or the Senate. We don't have any district staff or anything. We work for the chair, but we're still not there for that district. It's just that there's a chair who is in charge of that issue area particularly. Sometimes committee staff, so if your boss in a member office is voted out of office, you don't have a job anymore. A lot of times people do move around and find other jobs, but you don't necessarily, there's no reason, there's no one else for you to work for, so you don't, and people don't usually go, unless maybe their bosses retire, they're not gonna go work for the opponent who just voted out, or just beat out their boss. Whereas on the committees, because you're there for institutional knowledge, you often, sometimes folks will leave or will stay even when chairs move around, but essentially you are working at the whim of the chair of the committee. There are lots of, so the Congressional Research Service is part of Congress. It's a small organization, but they do research for staff, and they publish a lot of really great reports. Well, great if you like certain really boring versions of great, but about congressional staff. A lot of the information is public, just not super easy to parse, because again, each office is its own fiefdom, and when they publish, they do have to publish their salary data, but none of them do it in the same format, and some of them actually make ASCII, readable tables, and some of them are just scanned paper, and it's terrible. And there are a lot of efforts trying to modernize Congress, but Congress does a lot of things in a more old-fashioned way that is in progress. The relevant committees in the House and the Senate fairly mirror each other, and we have the appropriators and the authorizers. I work on the Science, Space, and Technology Committee. It's an authorizing committee. And what I've done is I've listed all of the chairs, and ranking member is the senior most minority committee person. So they would be the chair if they were in the majority. That's just what we call them. And you can take a look and see these essentially are the people. And I didn't include, because I just didn't have space on the slide and there were already too many things, I didn't include because energy is often treated a little bit separately. So I told you that we often forget about DOE, and then I didn't put DOE on the plot, so I'm really sorry. But I do at least talk about so a lot of these committees, the authorizing committees split up science and space. This is also how the science and space policy world is in DC, which I have found interesting, to say the least. So they're sort of in different worlds, but you see the presence of some folks that you might be surprised by, but these are the folks who have the most power when it comes to NASA and NSF. And so if any of them are your representatives, maybe a good idea to get to know them. And this formatted a little bit weirdly, but here are sort of what we've been doing with the House Science Committees lately. So our jurisdiction is everything our non-defense R&D in the federal government. And so that's full power over NASA and NSF, and then pieces of a lot of other agencies. We have subcommittees, so I work on space and aeronautics, as I said. I threw up a few of the big, to me at least, headlines from the Science Committee, some things that we've been working on related to Sharpiegate, and the sexual harassment bill came directly from the National Academy Study recommendations, and it's, in my opinion, an excellent bill. The AAS endorsed it while I was there as the Bacall Fellow. We recently just passed a Science Integrity Act just last week out of the committee, so a lot of really exciting things happening. We've been having hearings at a really high pace. Some of the other issues where we've been working on have been, of course, climate change, AI. We're trying to work on a NASA authorization bill. Literally right this second, if they've finished voting, there's a space weather hearing happening. Any committee in Congress, not just the ones that are doing impeachment things and get on network news, they're all streaming their hearings all the time. All of the information is public. The statements by the witnesses, it's all public information. So if you ever are curious, that's all available to you. It's a lot, but it's not behind closed doors. It really is all out in the open. It's just a lot that's going on. And particularly, I can just mention what my job is as a professional staff, because the title is not super informative, and that's partially because, again, each office is a fiefdom, and so for everyone, professional staff is a slightly different meaning. But essentially, in most committees, that means that we are usually subject matter experts in one way or another, and in whatever is relevant for whatever committee you're on. My job is to gather, evaluate, and be an honors broker for information of all kinds. And so that means engaging with stakeholders, who are folks like you, but also sort of anyone who wants to meet with us. We draft legislation, we write statements, correspondence, and then sometimes we get to be in the background on C-SPAN during one of our hearings. This is, I think, one of our first hearings. That's our subcommittee chairwoman, Kendra Horn, who is a freshman member, but also has a space background, which is fascinating. She worked for the Space Foundation, so she came from the policy side and went into space. So that's been great as a subcommittee chair. So one last sort of point to make is that sort of transitioning from just the Congress part, but thinking about in the public, and if you wanted to make a difference, I want to point out, because I think that a lot of folks don't always realize, that there remains significant support. If you ask people, do you like science? Do you want to fund science? Do you think the federal government should be funding science? The support tends to be very high, and it tends to be bipartisan. Most Americans say government investments in medical and science research usually pays off. This report on the right here was from Pew just in August, I believe, so it was very recent. I guess they did the survey during the first half of the year, but they just released it in August, saying that public trust in science and confidence in science is up, which I think is a good thing and something sort of counter to a lot of what I feel like the community's been feeling. One thing to point out, though, and these are all different, asking slightly different questions, but this center poll, which is also from Pew, asked, and again, I'm sorry, it formatted weirdly, asked what folks think the government should have a major role in, or whether the government should have a major role in X. And they listed a whole bunch of things. And you can see that many things are bipartisan, like, and highly supported. So 93 or 95% of Democrats and Republicans think that the government should play a significant role in keeping the country safe from terrorism. Okay. There are other things that have a significant partisan swing, so ensuring access to health care. 34% of Republicans feel that way, but 83% of Democrats feel that way. The thing that is the most, other than terrorism, bipartisan, is advancing space exploration. So that's great, except it's at 50%. And 50% is not very high. But the thing is, and this is a constant theme that I have found, and that we continue to find, is that folks like space. You talk to people about space, they love space. It's not a priority in the way that a lot of other things, understandably, have place a priority on. Even during the Apollo era, public polls were against Apollo. It did not reach 50% public support until July 1969, right before the actual landing. And then it sort of just hovered around 55% or somewhere for a couple of years, and then Apollo was canceled. So it never was highly supported from the public's view, because it's a lot of money that is hard to see the direct day-to-day payoff. And there are lots of other worries that are in many ways more important. I'm not going to go through this. I think the slides will be available, and if you want the slides, I have them, because there are many, many ways that you can be involved in policy. But I'm going to skip this for now, because I want to make sure that there's times for questions, and I wanted to just leave up some lessons that are selected lessons. Depending on the alcohol situation at dinner tonight, I might tell you more lessons if you really want to hear some more. But I do think that these are things that I'd like the community to know. Number one is what I was just saying, is that science, and particularly space science, particularly astronomy, and enjoys bipartisan support, and from places that you might not expect. Some of the biggest recent supporters of astronomy and planetary science have not been, I think, the folks that astronomers might have guessed. But it's a small fraction of the budget, And there are a lot of other issues that have a higher priority. And the result here is that it's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity because it means individual members of Congress, individual policymakers can have an outsized impact, for better or for worse. The example I like to use a lot is the establishment of the MREFC major projects line at NSF was essentially the project of one senator from West Virginia, Senator Byrd, who will be remembered in history for a lot of other things that he should be remembered for that are not very positive. But that is a thing that he did just because he wanted to make sure that West Virginia got to keep the Green Bank Observatory and rebuild it after it was collapsed. And it has had a huge impact on just the way that we do astronomy and the way that we do large facilities on the ground since 1990. I mean, that's a huge, one particular example. So I think that's something to keep in mind, that you can have an outsized impact with the right person. There are people in Washington who are advocating for you, for your institution, your field, whether you know it, whether you actually, if they're actually advocating for what you think is in your best interest. So you may want to get to know those folks and get involved. The decadal surveys are highly valuable, and any advocacy that undermines those surveys should be done very carefully and be really considered. And I think the community has a lot of thinking to do in terms of how advocacy can be done when you disagree with a survey. Because again, some of those folks who are advocating in theory on behalf of the community are not always, their bottom line is not necessarily the community. And then lastly, this is a small thing, but congressional staff, I know that especially if you're faculty, you get a lot of emails, especially for postdocs really, you all get a lot of emails, but staff get more emails than you do. I'm sorry, and they're way better at emails, and you have to, and if you get, they respond to emails very quickly. I know that some astronomers are good at emails, but I, as an astronomer, am very bad at email. And I know that a lot of faculty wait weeks to respond. If you get an email from a congressional staffer, try to respond that day. I know that that's hard sometimes, but that's how fast things can move on the Hill. So if you want to have, you get asked a question and you want to be part of the process, respond to your emails, and you might be asked to talk on the phone. I apologize to the millennials in the room. And with that, I'm going to end and take any questions.
Thank you, Ashlee. So we have time for a few questions.
Great talk, thank you. I remember hearing at some point, someone said that like Congress basically can't give money to anything without a field asking. Like they can't just be like, this is our new priority for science. They always have to base it off of a decadal or a proposal or something like that. Is that accurate, or is there, have you seen anything that's come out where members have just sort of decided that this is a thing that they want to push towards?
So members can do whatever they want. They write the laws, so they can do anything. Generally speaking, most of what they will do has its, at least on the field, in the fields that have decadal surveys, will be pointed at trying to support those. That said, as I said, individual members can have outsized impacts and can have their own pet projects or passion projects. The biggest example, and folks here probably know of John Culberson, who represented, for several years, used to represent a suburb of Houston, and he became chair of the House Commerce, Justice, Science Appropriations Committee, so he was basically the person, he could be entirely in charge of NASA and NSF's budgets, and he is an example of someone who, somewhat perhaps surprisingly to a typical astronomer, feels passionately, and I think he really feels in his heart, is passionate about the search for life in the solar system and outside of the solar system, and particularly on Europa. And so he is responsible in many ways. There are lots of people who are responsible for lots of things. So I don't mean he's the only person responsible, but he ensured and gave a lot of money to ensure that the Europa Clipper mission could happen and could be accelerated. But to your question, he wrote also that NASA had to do the Europa lander in short succession after Clipper, in just 2 years, essentially launched the lander 2 years after launching Clipper. And that was not a decadal priority. There's some discussion of semantics in the planetary science community in terms of whether it was an intended decadal priority, but essentially it was not a priority of the decadal. That's where I stand on it. But the way that he wrote the legislation was that NASA should do the Europa Clipper and lander the top priorities of the decadal survey, which is not exactly true, but it came with a lot of money. So there are examples of, so there in smaller ways, and not necessarily smaller, but there are examples of that, but it's not like it's a hard and fast, Congress can do whatever they want. But they do put a lot of stock in the decadal surveys and try to make sure that what they are doing can be connected at least to the decadal.
So with your warning about advocacy undermining decadal surveys, what do you mean by that? Any people who have like a pet project that didn't get
Yes,
priority?
yes. And look, the decadal surveys are not perfect. I think that there are many ways that they are imperfect. But the short version answer to your question is that, or a short kind of response, is that if you go to the Hill and say, because your pet project didn't get funded, or you really just hate flagships and you hate the JWSTs eating everyone's lunch and you just think we should stop doing flagships forever, even though that's not what the community consensus has said, it doesn't translate. If you go to Congress and shoot inward is the term that Joel Perry, my boss at WS, likes to mention, and it's not like that means that money is going to go to your pet project. I know that there are a lot of things that, because of a lot of budget issues and not just because they were prioritized in the decadal, I know that the high energy community has been feeling the push and has lost out on things that they possibly should have had, but that essentially you don't get much of anything and you can do harm if you, depending on how you do that advocacy. That said, when you go to the Hill, you should be honest, but I think the shooting inward does not help, and trying to trash the decadal process does not help, and I think it's better to try to make that process better if you think it is flawed.
Hi, Paul Shapiro. A few years ago, I was the chair of the APS Division of Astrophysics, during which time I did some lobbying.
Yep.
And it was very frustrating during the time that Republicans were in control of everything, House included. And so when we spoke to people on the House, on your committee and others, and we spoke to the Democrats, they would say, "You're preaching to the choir.
Yes.
No, everything you're saying, we're behind increasing the budgets for this and funding for that, but we can't do anything." Well, now things have changed. Could you comment on whether things have actually changed in that regard? How different is it now?
So I think there are a lot of layers there. So this is where the experience for space science and for astronomy is different than most of the rest of science. So when was this?
2014 to 2017?
Right, so the previous chair of my committee, Lamar Smith, is one of the examples of he was also from Texas, represented San Antonio, I believe, and bits of Austin maybe also? Yes, yeah. So many of you maybe have been represented by Smith, or at least are neighboring his district, his former district. He is an example of someone who is a fairly conservative Republican, but very passionate about astronomy in particular. The Science Committee held a number of hearings under more than anything else, probably, I might be wrong, but he held a bunch of astronomy hearings that were let's just talk about astronomy. He held a hearing on the eclipse, he held a hearing on a lot of other things, and it did translate in some ways to money and support for individual projects. But he was also someone who is a climate change denier and wanted to slash earth science funding at NASA, wanted to attack a lot of the other science, was trying to get the NSF essentially he was trying to change the peer review process at the NSF, so the NSF was only funding science that is directly had an economic benefit or implications for national security. He did a lot of other things that were not good for science. Now that things have changed, you can see, I mean, our committee has done a lot more, especially on those gaps and the places that weren't paid attention to, like climate change in particular and the nuances of climate change and issues on all sorts of issues, on oceans issues, on a lot of earth science issues. I would say that, so I think it's the big picture, very good news for science, for scientific integrity, for a lot of things. But again, I would emphasize the point that this is part of why advocacy can be important, because you still need a champion. And I would say that astronomy right now, with the retirement of people like Lamar Smith and John Culberson, or the defeat of John Culberson, with the retirement of Barbara Mikulski, I don't know who the champions in our field are right now. And we have not cultivated those champions, and because you need one of them. Barbara Mikulski, senator from Maryland, you have her to thank for Hubble and for James Webb. That's why MAST was renamed for Mikulski. She did a lot. She was the chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee. And when you get a powerful friend like that, that helps a lot from a money perspective. Again, net for science, I think things are much better. But we don't have a champion right now that I know of, at least.
All right, let's thank Ashlee again.